Uh, Hello. We're very excited to be in this meeting today. I'm absolutely honored to be with three of the sharpest minds on things associated with development, inequalities, the challenges of trade, technology. So this is really, really an honor for me to be here and to be opening this conversation. So the plan that we have ahead, the idea would be for our three panelists, we will have a very casual conversation on three topics, and then we will open for questions and answers. I have to say from the start that Daron Acemoglu had another meeting so he has to leave about 4 and 5, but that doesn't mean that we will cut short our hour and a half. So with that, good afternoon to everyone. As you know, around the world, the coronavirus is not only creating a tragic cost in terms of lives, but also in terms of livelihoods. And the cost of fighting the pandemic may be even larger in developing countries because the mechanisms that we have in our countries puts the economic process in a coma, while the pandemic is being managed and contained with very limited resources. For Latin America and the Caribbean, we have estimated that the pandemic could destroy about 17 million formal jobs, as well as many more in the informal sector. So today we wanted to talk about this balance between lives and livelihoods in medium-income economies and how we can contain the effects of fighting the pandemic on employment and incomes, and also of the world that will come afterwards and how to prepare to achieve better societies in that somewhat uncertain future. So as I mentioned, we have three spectacular, actually absolutely spectacular panel. This is something that we don't see that often, not at the IDB, but in general, because they are very, very important voices about what we're interested to discuss today. So I'm going to introduce first Daron Acemoglu. Is, as you know, a professor of applied economics in the Department of Economics at MIT. He has co-authored with James Robinson, Why Nations Fail, The Origins of Power, Prosperity, and Poverty, a presentation that we had at the IDB some years ago. But the important thing that we see there is an institution matter. And one thing that Daron Acemoglu has been discussing is about creative destruction. And destruction we will have with COVID, maybe not so creative, but it's going to cause a lot of destruction. So the question is, in my mind, institutions may or may not be prepared to take such a blow. He has a very interesting paper, a multi-risk SIR model with optimality, targeted lockdown. And he, with his co-authors, argue that policies that target higher risk age populations are better than generalized lockdowns, and that, in fact, most of the gains can be realized by having stricter lockdown policies in the oldest group. Now we have Nora Lustig. She's a professor of Latin American Studies at Tulane University, very well known in the topics of inequality. Her most recent publication is called Commitment to Equity Handbook, Estimating the Impact of Fiscal Policy on Inequality and Poverty, which is a step-by-step guide to assessing the impact of taxation and social spending on inequality and poverty in developing countries. So this book, apart from being an excellent study on the matter, is also a how to do it. And that in doing so, Nora has leaving no room for excuses to government responsibility in tackling inequality. In her recent piece, together with Nancy Bersel and Mariano Tomasi, she argued that lockdowns throughout the world are creating a new type of brutal inequality between the protected that can quarantine and the others unprotected that cannot. And finally, we have Mushfiq Mobarak. He's a professor of economics at Yale University, and his research interests include development economics, behavioral economics, environmental economics, and migration. All of them important for the discussions that we have today. In developing countries, we may need to be particularly proactive to mitigate the citizen exposure to disaster risk, something that he has been talking about, and here we are. In a recent article, Mushfiq study stated that imposing strict lockdowns in poor countries where people often depend on daily hands-on labor to learn enough to feed their families would lead to a comparable number of deaths from deprivation and preventable diseases. So with these three clear minds, we're ready to start this conversation. And let me start by asking on the questions of balance between lives and livelihoods to Nora Lustig. I wanted to ask you about this new piece that I mentioned that you wrote with Tomasi and Verso. And the question is, what can be done to reduce the effect of lockdowns? Is this responsibility of the governments or also something that we pass on to the private sector? We're going to have like 5-minute answers. So as we go to the next one is what we have in the future. Nora, please.
Yes, actually, there are two pieces. One is with Nancy, which is a blog post, and the other one is an article that we wrote together with Mariano Tomasi. Well, like you said, in the piece with Nancy, we emphasize the fact that the lockdowns have created something that we call a brutal new form of inequality between those who continue to have a steady source of income and between those who do not. And that the latter group includes not just the poor or the already poor, but the millions across the world who are now at risk of falling out of the middle class. And I think that what the pandemic has brought is that although every shock has a heterogeneous impact on different sectors of the economy, the pandemic presents us with an extreme case because entire sectors are completely shut down during lockdowns while others continue to operate quite normally. Although there's another inequality between the normal, which is between those who have to put their lives and health at risk to go to work, and those of us, all of us in this panel, which are the super privileged of the lockdowns who can work from the safety of our homes. So my short article with Nancy contends that while governments are implementing new and emergency programs to protect livelihoods of those affected, the traditional approach will not be enough and cannot happen quickly enough in most countries for most people. And what we're doing there is actually a little bit of an advocacy piece more than a research piece at this point, in which we're inviting people to think about what we, the lockdown lucky, can do to help the not so lucky. And there's lots of actions that people can do in everyday life that can help those who were left completely in the cold as a result of the lockdowns, from paying people who are doing your services while they're not doing your services, in nonprofit organizations sharing the cuts in instead of unemploying some of the people, everybody sharing the burden by lowering salaries of everybody. And overall, what we're arguing is that given the context, large corporations, large foundations, and the emblematic 1%, as well as the lockdown lucky, as I call them, need to jump in and not expect governments to do it all. I think that, in the future, an interesting area of research will be to examine the extent to which the lucky ones and the very rich were significantly more generous during this pandemic, and what factors facilitated or limited this generosity. So then, let me just mention one thing, and I don't know whether we're going to have time to show the results, but we're doing, we're actually trying to see empirically whether the lockdowns are actually affecting people all across the distribution in the context of Latin America, at the Commitment to Equity Institute, which I run at Tulane. And we have preliminary results for Argentina and Colombia. And this is work I'm doing with Stephen Younger, Valentina Martinez, and Federico Sanz, all of them associated now with the Institute. And if I am, do I have time to show the thing, or you want me just to describe what we find?
If you can put it fast, I think it would be great. Yes, we still
yeah, okay, so let me try. Okay. Yeah, I like those the pictures. No, this is, well, anyway, can you see this here, the top one?
Yes, okay.
Well, so let me just quickly, this is Argentina urban, this is Colombia urban, and your country. And what we have here at the bottom, the orange are the transfers, cash transfers in both countries. The yellow here, by the way, is consumption of home production, which in rural areas is a safety net somewhat. The gray are pensions, the blue is public employment, the green is the sectors that are considered not at risk by, I cannot go into the definitions how I got into that, and the blue are the at risk. And as we can see, actually the at risk is throughout the distribution, and therefore we probably have to expect that there will be losers both among the poor and the non-poor. And among the non-poor, those which are closer to the poverty line are at risk of becoming poor as a result and leaving the middle classes. And so let me now unshare. I don't know if it's clear, but on the horizontal axis, we have the income distribution from the poorest to the richest, and the colors are showing the composition of income by each one of the centiles. So the poor have a lot of transfers, right? And they have this amount of at-risk income. And the rich have very little in terms of the targeted cash transfers as we would expect. So what does this tell us is that, even though those are preliminary results and we're still checking and we're planning to do it for a bunch of other countries, the important message is that the at-risk incomes, the dark blue that I showed you earlier, show up throughout the distribution. And in the case of Argentina, is pretty flat. In the case of Colombia, the middle of the distribution actually appears to be facing a slightly greater risk because they're not receiving the cushioning from the transfers, and they have more at risk. They're more present at risk in the sectors that are at risk. Another fact to note from our analysis so far is the importance of cash transfers for the poor in providing an income floor, and the role of contributory pensions and public employment in providing income floors, especially for individuals from the middle to the top of the distribution. However, we need to be reminded that coverage of cash transfers for the bottom quintile of the population is around 1/3 in urban Argentina and about 40% in Colombia, where the average transfer is lower than in Argentina. So it's a lot of poor people who will not be protected, even though a bunch of them now have this cushion. So this analysis, I think, confirms something that we already suspected. Social protection measures will need to both provide income support to the pre-lockdown poor to prevent them from falling further into poverty, and compensate the losers even if they're not pre-lockdown poor. This can be costly, and in some countries, the mechanisms to reach those who are not in administrative registries may not be easily deployed. Hence, back to the point that I started with, the importance of the contribution from the private sector and the lockdown lucky to help provide what we call it people-to-people social protection, particularly during the emergency stage. Let me stop here now.
Thank you very much. Then I will ask Ahmed, who has pointed out that we might be picking one type of beds over the other ones, which is very, very tough. What would you recommend? What would be the balance, the first balance of the lockdown in the case of Latin America and the Caribbean? Any ideas that can inspire us on our recommendations and our conversations with our counterparts in Latin America and the Caribbean?
Thank you, Ana Maria. And so first, I want to congratulate the IDB for organizing this with Latin American Caribbean focus, because one of the things that's odd about this particular crisis is that, unlike say Zika or Ebola, it hit the rich countries first. So from day one, we started hearing a lot about what was happening in the US, UK, that took up all the oxygen in the room. We weren't in developing countries. We weren't asking the question: are the policies that are being adopted in rich countries, are they the same policies that we should be adopting in lower and middle income countries as well, right? And so what we ended up doing in this article that I have is that we basically said, okay, let's take the model that's been very influential in the US, UK, the Imperial College model, right? And let's put lower and middle income country numbers in it, okay? And let's see if you get the same answer, okay? And you don't get the same answer. So then there are three reasons. I'll just explain the quick intuition for why you get different answers. So first reason is that the age structure of the population is very different in poor versus rich countries. So that's That's a element that Daron also picks up on in the paper that he wrote that I've read. And so in high-income countries, the elderly share of the population is 600% higher than in low-income countries. And we know that this virus is much more dangerous for the elderly. And so, so you're going to get the costs imposed by the virus, and the benefits of lockdown, they're going to be very different, right? So that's one, it's the demographic structure of the population. Number two, remember we heard a lot about, on the right-hand side, what we have here, we heard a lot about flattening the curve. And we're trying to flatten the curve below the healthcare capacity line for each country, right? So that we don't get unnecessary excess deaths, right? But then if you are talking about, say, rural Bangladesh or rural Panama or countries in the, Guatemala, right? The healthcare capacity line is so low that by delaying infections, which is how you save lives in Japan or the United States, delaying infections, it doesn't actually allow you to save that many additional lives, right? Because if you don't have ventilators, you just don't have ventilators. It's not about just keeping the number of sick people below some level of ventilators. That's number two, okay? And so now that the benefits, so what these models tell you once you impose lower middle income country numbers is that the benefits of lockdowns are much smaller, right? Now you have to compare that against the cost, okay? And these costs, so we started collecting data immediately about 4 or 5 weeks ago in Bangladesh, Nepal, all over those countries, in Sierra Leone and in Nigeria. Right? Those are the countries I'm working in. And you see that the costs are not just hypothetical about hunger, et cetera, right? These are real. So this is a sample of people that I've been following in Nepal, in rural Nepal, since last year, right? And this is kind of the variation you see in their economic activity across seasons. So like sometimes they're busier during harvest periods, sometimes they're less busy during pre-harvest lean periods when you're waiting for the crop to grow, right? So this is the kind of variation you see, and this red line is the lockdown, and here's what happens after the lockdown. Even relative to the lean seasons, right, you have a huge drop in income earning opportunities. Other important thing that we can discuss later also is that there's huge drops in remittances, like a lot of remittance dependent households, right? They were forced back from India, right? So they don't have income, and they're also the ones that stayed back. They're not sending enough. They're not sending that much money. So ultimately, put this all together. What you're seeing, you see food insecurity levels reaching levels as high as the lean period, right? And what's amazing about that is that right now is their wheat harvest season, and even then, the food insecurity is as high as the lean season. So I shudder to think what's going to happen come July, August, September when the lean season actually arrives, because then you get the double whammy of both the lean season plus the lockdown effects, right? So put this all together, what you see is that health, safety are not their primary concern. Their primary concern is food security and income shocks right now, right? And so so I'll just end by saying, what you're seeing here is I'm not saying that, we shouldn't do lockdowns, we should follow Bolsonaro's policies, right? Because that of course has huge costs as well. But one size fits all policies don't make sense. We really have to think about the realities in any given country, right? And think carefully about the costs and benefits and compare the two in order to devise the policies that make sense, right? And there are some sensible things that all countries should be doing. So when I say, exemptions to lockdown, it should be for economic livelihood purposes, right? Social, religious gatherings still need to be stopped, right? In Bangladesh, we have the problem that people are still going to the mosque, right? Even though they're washing their hands, they're wearing masks reportedly, right? People have not stopped these gatherings, and that's a big problem we have. And how do you address that problem? In rural Bangladesh, the situation is you cannot, the government gave a directive, but the local masjid imams in various parts of the country are not listening, right? So we need to have policies that are about outreach to the right community leaders to make them participate and endorse the meeting, the messages that we have, right? Similarly, mask wearing norms should be universal. Masks are extremely cheap, right? My best read of the medical literature is that they are protective, even though the WHO does not have it as a guideline yet. And then we ought to be thinking about different age groups differently, right? We should protect the vulnerable and the elderly. And maybe we need to, that might be difficult for the government to do, but we need to take advantage of family institutions and partner with them and figure out and give them the responsibility of protecting the elderly and vulnerable family members, given their particular living situation. I'll stop there. You're
Thank you
on
very
mute.
much. No, I'm back. Yeah. Thank you so much. This is a fascinating study, very well. And I think it pointed out is something very interesting is don't make one cookie cutter. You have to think about different conditions, different countries, which I think is great. But one thing that you mentioned is part of the things that you can differentiate things and taking decisions bring us to the something that I would wanted to pass to Daron, which is what is about this idea that we should protect the elderly and try to actually quarantine them, but make sure that the others could interact and maintain the economic activity, because that might be one of the parts that will make policy recommendations that fit something that Ahmed presented us today. Daron, please, how we can do that in Latin America and the Caribbean? I think the numbers is about 25% of the population in Latin America might not be old, but they live with old people, and you don't have a lot of possibilities to bring them or send them over. So over to you.
Well, thank you, Maria. Thank you very much, Ana Maria, and it's great to be here. Thanks to IDB for organizing it. It's a great pleasure to be sharing the stage with you, Ana Maria, Nora, and Mushfiq. And I also want to apologize in advance to the audience. Unfortunately, because of scheduling, I will have to leave around 4:05 or so. But I also want to say it's rare that I have been on a panel on COVID-related things where I wholeheartedly agree with the comments made by the previous participants. I think really Nora and Mushfiq really framed the question beautifully. First of all, I think for those of us who are in advanced economies and are in white-collar jobs, the lockdown is very different than the rest of the world. Actually, the brutal inequality that Nora very astutely describes is true within the US as well. The groups that are suffering the economic consequences, the mental health consequences of the lockdown, because they are, cooped up inside with inadequate financial and housing resources, are very different than, most of the voices we hear. So I think that's an important aspect. And there's another dimension of this brutal inequality, I think, in advanced economies as well, educational inequality. In the US, educational resources were very unequally distributed already. That's true in Latin America as well. And the people who see their children still continue with some sort of learning are not representative, because most schools don't have the resources to continue that. So I think there's going to be a long run consequences of this brutal lockdown as well. So I think it's very important for us to start thinking about alternative ways of tackling the crisis, a problem that, in my opinion, has been made much, much more difficult by some really bad sort of leadership positions in the world, like Trump and Bolsonaro, who have, defended thoughtless policies of not taking the COVID-19 seriously, but they have also sort of really tilted the argument that we have to find ways of lessening the impact on the most economically vulnerable communities, while at the same time protecting those who are at risk. I think that discussion, in my opinion, should start exactly where Mushfiq already started. So at the risk of repeating what Mushfiq said, some medical experts characterize COVID-19 as two separate diseases. One with, some unknown consequences, but so far no evidence that they are extremely severe for the great majority of the population, and one that's very severe for those who are above a certain age, 65, some, but even above 65, and with comorbidities. Health inequality has been really a determining factor, and that's part of the reason why you're seeing, in the US, the problem has come on top of health inequality, and you are still also seeing that in some of the developing countries which are suffering. So that suggests that, rather than sort of a lockdown, no lockdown, we have to find ways of dealing with this that, uses this aspect of the virus, while at the same time try to sort of protect the economically vulnerable groups, which, you know, again, Nora and Mushfiq have very rightly pointed out. I think Mushfiq is showed the data in a very clear way, and says same thing from Nora's data. You know, in most developing countries, including in Latin America, you know, there is so much of the population that is at the at borderline poverty and don't have the resources to actually withstand a very lengthy lockdown. So I completely agree with Nora that we have to find ways of bolstering the social safety net, but I don't think there is going to be enough resources to do that. Far from it. And then another complicating factor is that state capacity is very limited. Even if the resources were there to deliver them, you know, even the US is having a hard time with that. Not that US has great state capacity, but certainly better. You know, in Colombia, for example, you know, 40% of municipalities during normal times don't get the most basic services like notary services, health clinics, you know, and you know, sanitary condition in sewage and drinking water and so on. So how are you going to reach those communities when, you know, you have to very quickly try to do something much more complicated? So I think all of these have to be taken into account. And part of the objective of the research that I did with Chernozukov, Ivan Werning, and Mike Winston was exactly to develop a framework like that. Although, you know, we focused on the US because that's where all the sort of first level of the analysis has been for many of the papers. And our conclusion is that you can have much better outcomes by protecting the most vulnerable group. And I think in that context, you know, I don't want to get into the details, but the strategy is simple. You can never isolate any group. We live in a very connected world, so you have to take that into account. But still, additional protection for the vulnerable groups. In the US, that would include people who live in nursing home as well as who live with their families. I think you know, we spell out some feasible strategies as well as some quantitative evidence. Here, I want to touch on two additional topics before I hand it back to Ana María. One is what Ana María raised, which is how do you deal with this when, you know, 25% of the population actually live together with the elderly. So I think we have to design new ways of dealing with this. So one size fits all policies won't work. I am no admirer of the Turkish government, and I have been a frequent critic of them, but they have actually done a couple of things that have worked reasonably well, which go in the direction of what Mushfiq has suggested, which I think could be tried in other countries as well in Latin America. One is that they have put a very strict shelter in place for the above 65 and under 20. So people between the age of 20 and 65 can go to work, but those above 65 are not allowed to leave their home. Again, there's slippage because state capacity is limited, but it's been consistently employed. Second, the shelter in place there is during the weekends, sometimes extended weekends. So 3-4 days of work, 3-4 days of nobody's allowed to leave their home. So especially when this coincides with public holidays and the weekend, this prevents social gatherings, but it has less effect on work that has continued. But it still doesn't get to the issue of what happens when people go to work and then they carry the virus home. I think we have to have a menu for that. First of all, we have to provide information and means so that within a given household, there is additional social distancing, sanitizers, hand washing, masks when people interact sometimes within the household together with their vulnerable groups, and also some resources for some people to be temporarily out of their houses, although that opens a lot of difficulties that I think we have to be quite clear about, like such as those that we've had to endure within the United States and Sweden and the UK with care homes or nursing care homes. But the second point that I want to make is that you know, we have been relying on these SIR models for our thinking, and Mushfiq has also been using, and I think there's a lot to learn from those models. One interesting aspect of those models is that actually, when you think about it, there are two types of solutions that they provide us for dealing with the virus. Caricaturizing it, one is waiting for the vaccine. The other one is herd immunity. So a lot of the epidemiological work, for a variety of reasons, especially because of the focus in the US and the UK, advocates essentially waiting for the vaccine. Sometimes this is also imposed on the models because they impose a hard constraint that the number of infections shouldn't reach beyond a certain level so as not to overwhelm the ICU capacity, for example. But if you change the parameters or if you change your objectives a little bit, the model would almost discontinuously say, actually, you can achieve something else with herd immunity. Now, the problem is that if you have a very old population, as Mushfiq pointed out, and not enough ICU capacity, and depending on when herd immunity is reached, herd immunity could have disastrous consequences. Now, the question is, can we actually withstand herd immunity being reached in some developing countries? And I think this is a discussion we need to have. It's actually a very risky discussion because sometimes there's very strong reaction to the discussion of herd immunity. And I'm not saying that we should necessarily go for herd immunity, but I think many developing countries are essentially going for herd immunity, but doing that without realizing what you're doing is much worse than having that discussion and see how we can do that in a way that actually protects the people. And then again, by age or by demographic group, policies and other social distancing, group distancing measures might be very important. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. I think this conversation already puts a lot of very interesting data, call attention to a number of things of the discussion on policy. And because the tension between livelihoods and lives, so tense, our chat is already exploding on questions on Sweden. And are you taking what happened with, so having that conversation already shows that we brought good ideas, new ideas, and new data to show how you have to tackle with this and the limitations of the things that you can do. So this proves us that this first half hour has been already very powerful and for the audience that is here with us. But let me turn a little bit on something, which is, so this is one level of the discussion. The other one, what is the future that we're going to find when things passes or as we move into the new reality? And one is about inequality. One thing that we know is that there's the destruction of value, but is that destruction of value distributed equally, or would have, again, even worse situations of inequality than we had before? And one of the elements that comes very much is how this pandemic put the issue of IT, digital solutions, IT, artificial intelligence very much in the forefront, saying you should move in that, you should use that, but maybe you should replace some of the workers with this type of solutions, something that Daron has been working a lot on. So if you start this second part of the conversation about inequality, or can we make this crisis something that bring us opportunity for better equality, or we're heading, if we don't do something, into worse inequality, particularly with the emphasis on what the new digital technologies are bringing to the fore. So 5 minutes are, and I will follow on that with our other two panels.
Well, thank you, Ana Maria. So I think this is absolutely a critical discussion, and I think one that we're not paying enough attention to. Again, for those of us in white-collar jobs and fortunate situations, we are so grateful for all these digital technologies. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having these wonderful webinars. But I think this is high time for us to think about what digital technologies, in particular automation technologies, have done and what their future might be. And I want to, I have a lot to say on this, but time is short, so I'm going to put it in stark terms. So I think the evidence, some of it from my own work over the last 10 years or so, is that we have used digital technologies in a rather biased way over the last several decades. And we've done a lot of automation, which has helped some firms and which has helped some types of workers, but has kept labor demand growing very slowly. and has created a lot of inequality in the developed countries. Developing countries were just about coming to the epicenter of this crisis, because one view was, well, this is second order for developing countries because they're not adopting these automation technologies as much. Well, there was some truth to that at the early stages, but by now, automation technologies were competing with the products that developing countries were introducing, and the developing countries, some of them, Latin America, among many Latin American ones among them, are actually adopting many of these automation technologies. And then the third element of my story is that there's nothing inevitable about this. If I have some charts, but I'm not going to show you on the US patterns and the European patterns, but the point of the charts is that the way that we've used these digital platforms was very different, say, before the 1990s than the way that we use them after the 1990s. In particular, if you take a platform like AI, you can use that to create more jobs, to create technologies that increase human productivity, or you can try to find ways of just automating everything and substitute capital for labor. And we've done much, much more of the latter over the last 30 years than the former. And that has had a major role in understanding why labor demand has grown slowly, why inequality has increased, and so on. And again, this will have more and more impact on the developing world. Developing world is going to be part of the AI revolution, but it's not an active participant because it's been, it's like the old style appropriate, inappropriate technologies. The developing world is not at the table about how these AI technologies are being developed, but is the recipient of all of these consequences. Now enter the coronavirus. What we are doing right now is that to the firms' priorities that they don't want the workers because they are expensive, they're getting subsidized for their capital, or they don't want to deal with the labor relations. Now you add that workers get the virus, workers may be locked down, workers may not be available. So there's an additional reason, and you're seeing all over the news, many firms going more in the direction of using machines, AI, and restructuring things so that they don't really need the workers even more than before. So what that means is that the coronavirus, in the short term, the digital technologies are a savior, but in the long term, they might actually deepen a crisis that has been going on for 3 decades. That we may create certainly not a jobless future, but a future where jobs, especially good, high-wage paying jobs, for most workers are in very short supply. And if we do that, its social consequences for the developed world will be terrible, but they would be much more sweeping and problematic for the developing world, which really needs these jobs for generating a middle class, which really needs jobs in those sectors in order to be able to climb up the value chain. So all of these are actually critical. And as I said, one problem is that the developing world is not at the table when these decisions are being made, which brings me to the last point. I think the developing world needs to be at the table. It needs to pool its resources in the same way that it did during the Green Revolution, and try to come up with alternative visions of how new technology should be created and should be used. I think that's actually an imperative that was quite important before the crisis. It's become critical after the crisis.
I think I could agree more. Everybody should be at the table, and for sure, not everybody is. So this is great. I wanted to turn to other aspects of what this future is going to look like, apart from technology. And Nora has been working intensively and pointing the importance of changing the social security systems. Is there hope? What would you like to see in the social security systems of after the pandemic that we could thrive for? You're in mute, Nora.
I'm muted? I don't have control of the muting, so well, I've been fascinated by the remarks of Daron and Mushfiq, and thank you, Ana Maria, for having me. I forgot to thank you earlier, but I want to say something, if I may, before I make my comments on what you asked me to Daron about technology. I've always thought about it in the following way. If we were in a world in which everything could be done without us doing any work, and have, robots or whatever taking care of everything, why would that be bad per se as long as you could distribute the goodies. So the problem is not necessarily the technology, it is the arrangement that the technology is owned by one group that actually captures the rents and income that come from that technology, and those who are left aside are not able to take advantage of it. So I think we need to think about it in a different way, and I'm just going to leave it at that because that's a very, very profound discussion, because what does it mean for capitalism and the market system more broadly? But I wouldn't be upset if we were in a world in which I could decide whether I want to do the work or a robot does it, as long as I have my income. That's, I'll leave it at that. So let me go to your question about the social protection systems, which, by the way, the definition of social security, safety net, social protection, it goes back and forth. But I tend to, from the times in which I was the head of the poverty unit at the IDB, we used to call social protection the umbrella concept, and under it we had the social security and the social assistance system. I think that we know that even before the pandemic in Latin America, their systems are inefficient and inequitable, and that they left large pockets of the population without access to safety nets. The pandemic is a sharp wake-up call that, especially the latter, the social protection gaps, can kill us all. And Mariano Tomasi and I argue in this recent paper that I mentioned earlier that during a pandemic, universal social protection becomes a precondition to achieve success in combating the spread of the disease. If we cannot compensate those who cannot earn a living during lockdowns, the protocols will be breached, as we have seen them, and the virus will spread. And the same goes for group populations that are excluded because of their migratory status or discriminatory practices. Forgetting or excluding to protect certain sectors of society can severely hinder the ability to contain the spread. Now, even if we are not thinking, and I'm going to come back to this, we have to remember in Latin America and in the developing world that the crisis is not just linked to lockdowns. It's linked also to the adverse shocks that come from crises in the advanced countries and China. Those are not going away, even if you get rid of all the lockdowns in the South. And those will have to be dealt with also in terms of their social costs and have social protection measures in place. Now, thinking about the future in terms of reforms, Ana Maria, I just want to say a couple of things. It's a long discussion, but I think that as the IDB thinks of the future systems, addressing very prominently how to get rid of the gaps, of the social protection gaps, has to be front and center. Because otherwise we will recurrently face these problems, even without a pandemic. When you have an economic crisis, sometimes you face the same issues because we have these gaps. I think that the ideas that the IDB has been pursuing that were introduced initially by Santiago Levy of replacing the contributory systems by universal ones funded from general revenues, for me is the most promising, although politically challenging approach. And you also asked me the questions that were sent to me, what would be the financing sources for the new systems? And I think, there's quite a bit you probably can extract from current spending patterns. You asked me about spending, and I think, there should be an analysis of sort of like saying, where are the subsidies that shouldn't be there and which projects, including investment projects, should not be happening. But I think we also need to think about on the tax side. As we know, in most countries in Latin America, personal income taxes and wealth taxes are way too low still. And we probably can do much more in terms of introducing progressivity and creating more, a bigger resource base, and at the same time, make the system more equalizing. So let me stop here.
Thank you, Nora. Of course, it wasn't an easy question and not for 5 minutes for sure. But at least we put that as part of our agenda for the future. On that, and I'm moving in different sides of what is the future and the challenges that we're going to have. Of course, IT, of course, social security system. And I wanted to pass something to Ahmed Mushfiq, for which I have to apologize. Everybody has been sending me and said, you should say Mushfiq, not Ahmed. But my pronunciation is better on the first part of your name than in the second. So I do apologize, but I hope both are good.
No problem.
And one thing that you have been writing a lot is on the issue of migration. And migration is it has been in Latin American area a big thing. We didn't have the movements of people that we have had recently, number one. And second, the other thing is that we anticipate that as you have all this poverty rising, a lot of migrant workers that cannot work in their countries will move. So we might have a crisis on the migrants that we have now, and maybe we'll have another kind of a wave of migrants coming in. Could you tell us what is coming and what we should be prepared for, and trying to make sure that our audience here is aware of the importance of tackling the issue of migration when we consider the future? And please send your question here. There's plenty of them. Send them to the chat. Please, Mushfiq.
Okay, thank you, Ana Maria. So I'll take a page out of Nora's book and make some comments to Daron and Nora before answering your question. And I just wanted to interpret technology a little bit differently and connect it to Nora's answers about social benefit transfers. So, we're working, as I mentioned, we're working with the governments of Bangladesh, Nigeria, in order to do some evidence-based COVID responses. And, and I do the normal type of thing I do, which is collecting microdata from around the country to see what we can learn from it. But in the middle of this, they gave us an insane task. It started in Bangladesh, which is, look, we need to send social benefit transfers, relief payments to poor people quickly, right? And in relation to Daron and Nora's earlier comments, like regardless of what policies we might choose in terms of social distancing, lockdowns or not, or free for all or whatever it is, one thing that's clear that we need to send relief payments, right? And now the problem for us is, okay, we need to send relief payments. We just don't know who needs relief. Like, how do you identify the people who need it, right? That's a huge problem, right? And even relative to India, in Bangladesh, we don't have like a system, a pre-existing system where people were connected to bank accounts, etc., right? And so here, technology came to the rescue. So the only way to design such a system in 3 weeks, which is our deadline, is that the only thing that people carry around in their pocket these days is technology, like they have cell phones, okay? So what we can do is look at, so there are some households for which we have ground truth data on who's poor. They have cell phones, and it won't surprise us to learn that the poor and the people who are suffering, they have subtle differences in their cell phone usage patterns and the non-poor, right? And so then you can let loose a machine learning model to detect these subtle differences in patterns, and that's the way that you can quickly indirectly identify people who need transfers today. But let me move on to your question, though. If later on there's questions about this, I'm happy to get into the details, because the combination of the machine learning and the politics of making transfers this way is really, really interesting. But on migration, okay, so here are 2 ways in which migrant families are experiencing the COVID crisis differently than families that are not dependent on migration remittances. Right, number one, I already said that migrant families are experiencing much larger income shocks, okay? So let me show you some data on that, okay? So here on the left, and we have this data both from Bangladesh and from Nepal. So on the left, it turns out that we had samples where we started collecting like post-COVID data. We had samples of people that we had been tracking for a while, and there was also nice variation in that sample. So the Bangladesh government had run a lottery to send agricultural workers to Malaysia, right? And they had to run a lottery because there were 10,000 visas in Malaysia. Everybody wanted them. 1.5 million people applied. And so they had to allocate by lottery, right? So for those who care, like we have nice variation in the migration decision as well. It's like total random variation, okay? And what we learned from these data is that we've been tracking them since 2013 when the lottery was conducted. From 2013 to 2019, the migrant families or the lottery winners were earning between 18% and 100% more than the lottery losers, right? So in general, they're doing much better. Come April 2020, we collected data again. Now the migrant families or the lottery winners are actually earning 36% less, right? It's completely reversed, right? Mm-hmm. Why is that reversed? So you see, in Nepal, like remittances fall. Why do remittances fall? Both because of many migrants are forced to return, and because even the ones staying back are sending less money back, okay? So that's one big difference between migrant and non-migrant families. And the second big difference is that everybody now recognizes that migrants bring the disease back. So they now face a lot of stigma. So what we have to do is, these guys are being forced back. They need to reintegrate to the local labor markets. On top of that, nobody wants to go near them, right? And the fear of migrants is real. So we also collected data on symptoms, like COVID symptoms around the country. And so if you are in a community that saw a recent migrant returnee in the last 2 weeks, you are almost 3 times as likely to report COVID symptoms compared to being in a community where there was no migrant returnee. Right? That's how the disease spread in Bangladesh, and like people coming back from Singapore, from Italy, right, when they were sent back. Right? So now this is going to cause a huge social, problem for us, which is that we rely on migrants. Remittances account for about 10% of GDP. In many Latin American countries, you have similarly large numbers, right? And how do you design social policy specifically for the migrants? And the one final thing I'll say is that the migration and COVID link is so strong that you can, in fact, use migration patterns to even predict where exactly COVID is spreading in the country, right? So one of the things we did for the government of Bangladesh is produce maps like this, right? And these maps, one input for these maps is let's just look at the data on airport returnees, like the disembarkation guard data on who returned to the country from Italy, from Singapore, from Korea, etc., between December and March, right? And we know their addresses, so we know which district they went out to. Right? So we can like create an exposure index for every district on people returning from COVID-affected areas, right? And so, so how well does this do? We can match it to like quarantine data. We can match it to data on distress calls that the government is getting. Like we coordinate with the telecom companies in order to get where these phone calls are coming from. And it turns out that these just a migration-based exposure fits very well with exactly where you're seeing distress calls, etc. Right? So one quick pitch I wanted to make here is that this particular strategy that we use for Bangladesh, like once you have the data, you can use it anywhere, right? So we also implemented this in, say, the Philippines, right? So if there are Latin American, Caribbean countries, from all the listeners who are coming in, who are interested in understanding sort of spatial allocation decisions within the country, we're very happy to do tasks like this.
Thank you very much. One specific question, just to understand the data that has been put here as a question. The majority of these migrants that you're talking are highly skilled or very low skilled?
Yes, so it turns out that we have both types. So there are international migrants, right? And there are internal migrants, right? And so while the remittance story I was telling you about, the 10% of GDP, that's coming from international migrants. Okay, and the international migrants that Bangladeshis who are working in Singapore, in Kuwait, in Saudi Arabia, in UAE, right? They are going all the way from, say, gardeners and maids, right, all the way up to doctors and engineers, right? Oh, okay. And then the internal migrants are much lower skilled. So you have like garment factory workers who are moving from rural areas to sort of peri-urban areas where the garment factories are. And they're both carrying disease, of course, they're both dangerous, and they're both now facing huge shocks. Both types are facing huge negative shocks.
Yeah, very similar things we see in Latin America, but it was a good question from our audience that I think was very relevant to put it. As you see, we had so many things to discuss that we wanted to talk about what we do now, what we will see in the future, but the other one is what we will do, what is the job market, what the jobs of the future, what is what we wanted to see when things are going to be so disruptive, changing so fast. We know that Daron, as I mentioned at the beginning, has to leave us in about 5 minutes. So Daron, before you go, and thank you very much for being with us, it would be great if you tell us, should we do a very active promoting good jobs for the future? Is something that the government should be doing? And there's such a thing as the good jobs that we can identify.
Thank you, Ana Maria. Yes, I think that is critical, and it actually is. Thanks for asking that question, because it feeds in very naturally to the issues that I touched upon. And I think the answer to this question at some level is connected to the question that Nora posed. would we be happy if we had robots do all the jobs and then a fiscal system that redistributed all the gains? And I guess my view is that it is very difficult for me to imagine such a fiscal system being operated anywhere for political economy reasons, when all political power is in the hands of a small group of people who operate and design and create the robots, or sometimes own the robots. But even if you could solve the political economy problems, they're really impossible, really, in the developing context, I think. I'm not sure whether that would be a good social arrangement. I think most people define themselves through their jobs. They form their social networks through their jobs, and they become more active as citizens in the context of actively participating in the job market. So I think for that reason, it isn't, to me, an appetizing future if we found a way of replacing everybody with robots or AI. But even more relevant in some context is that I think what we need isn't just jobs for people to do menial tasks, but more sort of meaningful jobs. So this is what I sometimes refer to as good jobs, which is defined by some job security, high wages, and also, I think, some social purpose that individuals feel, which, for many generations, they've done that in various types of manufacturing, service jobs, or sometimes even in agricultural jobs. But this sort of job security and high wages, for example, have been missing in many service jobs in the developing and the developed world, and certainly in the agricultural sector. So the question is whether, this focus on good jobs is something we can afford to moving forward. And if it is indeed a focus, how do we make that a reality? So I think we are between a rock and a hard place. I think there are going to be more and more pressures for cost cutting, which will eat not just into jobs, but into good jobs. All of the concerns that Nora and Mushfiq already sort of also contributed to. But even more importantly, even if that's a feasibility, how do we kind of adopt policies that encourage good jobs? And I think there we really need to experiment with various different policies. I think the details are very much where the devil is, and they're up for grabs. But I think there are two pillars here that are critical. And at the expense of sounding like a parrot, one of those is exactly the direction of technological change. Why? Well, because if all of the technological energy, ingenuity, and effort is going into creating jobs that replace workers, no effort to create jobs that the technologies that complement humans, it's going to be impossible for the economy to create good jobs. You can have unions, you can have minimum wages, you can have social norms that push up wages, but then employers are immediately going to shift into machines because machines are getting more and more productive and humans are not keeping up with them. So I think the technological element is critical, and that goes back to all of the things that I said already. But then there's a second element. Technology needs to be complemented with institutions. And that's where protection for workers, especially in many industries where worker-firm relations are not competitive, so bargaining power, norms are going to be very relevant. Those are issues that we have to tackle. So there's like this complementary institutional and technological aspects that are going to be critical. And that's where the devil's really in the details, because what works in some contexts will not work in others. So for example, we see in Germany, work councils and other arrangements have done rather well in terms of protecting workers in the face of automation. They have led to higher wages in many establishments that have adopted robots. But the same arrangements are not going to work in Latin America, where there is going to be need for diversifying into different sectors, competing in the export markets and so on. So I think there's a lot of work ahead of us to say, how do we direct technology in the right direction? And how do we create complementary institutional mechanisms so that we don't just create, jobs for the lowest wage, lowest skill employees, but these sort of good jobs that are, I think, important for both the political economy and the social evolution of these places as well.
Daron, thank you very much. We were very glad to have you here. Please stay with us as long as you can. We are aware that you might have to leave us very soon for our committee. Thank you. It's great to have you. We hope to have you again because a lot of questions.
It was great being there. Sorry, I have to leave. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. With that, I wanted to follow on what Daron had put the ball kicking, and is something that I wanted to ask to Mushfiq. And that is, you have put a lot of attention on how getting people to work in manufacturing sector, in more formal sectors, in a little bit higher end, including for women, is critical, and the difference could be substantial. Now, we see that a number of these type of manufacturers may disappear. So what do you see we should start thinking even now for public policy to create better jobs for the future?
So I'll just give 1 minute background on the work you're referring to for the audience, so that we can put it in context, and then so the work that Ana María is bringing up is past research I've done on the effects of availability of manufacturing sector jobs on the lives of women, and this was done in rural Bangladesh. And in fact, I just remembered that I gave a talk at IDB on this like 6-7 years ago. And so what you find is, Bangladesh has had this explosive growth for the last 30 years in ready-made garments manufacturing. It now accounts for 85% of our exports. It's the second largest producer after China of ready-made garments, right? And so as this growth occurred over time, what we see is that this was for the first time, it created job opportunities for women, because about half of all the employees in these factories are girls and women. I shouldn't say girls, they are adult women. About 50% of these employees. And so this, for the first time, it created job opportunities for women in a country where traditionally women had not worked outside the home, okay? And when that happened, what you observe in the data is that the families that had greater access to these factories, given where they live relative to where the factories were located, right? They responded by starting to put their daughters in school. And in Bangladesh, even like 15 years before the Millennium Development Goals deadline, or maybe 20 years before the deadline, we were able to achieve gender parity in education. And in fact, girls enrollment now outstrips boys enrollment for the last 20 years, okay? And then fast forward about 10, 12 years, those girls who were put in school and then got access to factory jobs, they became less likely to be married off at the age of 16, 17. They became less likely to have their first childbirth at the age of 17, 18, 19, etc. Right? So all in all, very good things happened, right? In terms of educational investments for girls, followed by delayed marriage, delayed childbirth, which are, we know from other research, to be very good outcomes, okay? And so now let's fast forward to the COVID world and what happened, okay? So one of the first things that happened is because the COVID hit EU and US, which are the biggest markets for Bangladesh, right? They canceled all orders, right? And they behaved really terribly. So not only did they cancel orders, they refused to pay. This is all, the contracts are all on back pay once you deliver, right? They refused to take possession of the orders that they had already made. So these are buyers like H&M, Walmart, and their subsidiaries, right? Who under international pressure has now acted a little bit better, but there are many buyers that have not. They're refusing to pay, and we suddenly saw $1 billion losses in the sector, right? So not only does that lead to export losses, right? You also immediately see that based on the research that I'm describing, that's going to have huge adverse effects on the lives of young women in Bangladesh sooner or later, right? When these jobs disappear. And so now, when you look at what is the policies that the government's enacted, so there are social benefit transfers, relief payments that have to be paid out. But the very first thing that the government did was to target these garment factories. Okay, And so they had similar to the United States policy, right? There was, I mean, of course, much smaller numbers. We don't have trillion-dollar budgets, but there was money given to the garment factories on the condition that worker wages continue to get paid, right? And here there was also technology that was used. So as soon as the government announced this, you know, we now have emerging sort of mobile money technologies in the country, right? And the government's requirement was, in order to make sure that this is not money that goes into the pockets of the factory owners, leaving the workers in the bind, like we need to send, you know, we're going to use the mobile money companies to send the wage subsidies or the relief payments directly into the mobile wallets of the factory workers, right? And I think that was a very, very smart decision. So again, this is a case where government policy, the private sector, as I mean, both the factories, but also a new type of private sector, which is the technology-enabled one, right? All had to come together to address that problem.
Well, that was, in a way, not a surprise, but it is devastating the dimensions. And again, this is about inequality, not only of income, but ability of power and access to government and who does the decisions and how. So thank you very much for that. One thing for all the audience, and of course we're going to ask our panelists here, is this research, or the ones that are public, are going to be put for us to read more carefully, because it's such a rich basis of information, and we're going to include a couple of ones that show similar results for Latin America and the Caribbean. So thank you very much. I think this is very, very important. And I think it is important on the gender agenda that, as other things that we have seen, the Latin America and the Caribbean moving forward, the fear is that to what extent the pandemic is going to make us go backwards. And on that, I wanted to pass on to Nora. One thing that I know that you have, and you're a very good student, and you're careful about the question that we put to you. We said, what we can do better to protect the poor and vulnerable in the future. But I wanted to turn it a little bit with a twist. What we can do for jobs and employment. If we go to the point of Daron, people work not only because of the income that they need, is because their identity, the possibilities, the engagement. When we see the things that we see in Mushfiq for women, work is much more about not only getting a job and getting an income, it's a full sense of opportunity that opens. So Nora, said that you're in your hands. What we can do to improve the lives of people associated with better jobs at all levels?
Well, I have no answer for that. I would not be where I am if I had it. And I disagree. I mean, there was no opportunity to continue the conversation with Daron, but I hope to continue it later, because I think people can find very satisfactory things to do in life, even if they're not related to a job that's paid. But that's, you know, totally different type of discussion. And but let me better, you know, to focus on the question that I was asked to answer, please, Ana María, if you don't mind, because I think that you know, I think what we're facing now in Latin America is a very dangerous situation in terms of what's happening in many of the countries regarding both what's happening with current poverty and how we are actually, if you want, planting the seed for poverty in the future if we do not address some of the issues that are affecting the poor and the near poor in the short term. And that will also obviously affect their ability to insert themselves in jobs that are more productive in the future. I think that right now, one of the things that, you know, in the work that we've been doing with Mariano and others, we have found is that one of the big divides is the ability of the population in Latin America, depending on what socioeconomic class they belong to continue their education during the lockdowns. And also, I think we have to think beyond the lockdowns. So like I said earlier, something linked to the crisis itself. In past crises, we have seen that people tend to drop out of school more frequently or enter school later. or don't continue from one level to the next once they graduate. And that affected inequality in Latin America in the 1990s. When we studied with many of my colleagues like Chico Ferreira at the World Bank, some of the colleagues that are now at the IDB, and Felipe Lopez Calva, the patterns of inequality in Latin America, one thing that we did this is sort of find is that what happened in the education front in the 80s was one of the main causes of why you saw inequality rising in the 90s, because of the skill premium given the relative scarcity of people with higher skills. Then you had a process in Latin America, which was a bit of converse of what you've seen in advanced countries, especially in the US, in which as a result of investing in education in the 90s, you had the relative wages of the unskilled increasing more in relative terms versus the skilled, and that was behind the lower inequality. I think that what's happening now is going to take us back to a situation in which there's going to be a relative abundance of low-skilled workers, which, coupled with the trends that Daron was mentioning, is a terrible combination, because the demand for these workers will be lower. And there'll be, like I said, a more abundance of them. So what we can probably see in the future is a rise, particularly in earnings inequality, that will drive inequality overall again upward. And that's a permanent effect that I fear from this crisis. Like I said, it's not just the pandemic itself, it's the economic crisis that Latin America is suffering, as many of the countries are giving, the example from Bangladesh, the fact that some of the main markets are shutting down is regardless of whether Bangladesh is affected by lockdowns or not. Those are effects that will be there, and they will be there for quite some time. So it's very important to act now, and in the social protection agenda, go beyond the sort of just income transfers, which are so important. I mean, they're basic, but also make sure that inequalities in other dimensions that affect the ability of people to become productive down the road are not exacerbated. And I think that on the digital side, in addition to things that have been mentioned, it's very important to see what do we do to make sure that poor children in Latin America can continue their education through the support of digital technology, accessible and not expensive, if possible free, and here maybe the private sector can help, and also with adequate mentoring systems, so you can have the ability of helping students to continue their education through means that are very unique, which is using distance learning through electronic means. So that's one of the things I wanted to say. I also wanted to say that what we're finding in the work that we've been doing, looking at the who gets hurt by the lockdowns, we can expect higher inequality from the way the lockdowns are operating, but the losses, again, we find them throughout the income distribution. And therefore, I want to emphasize again that you have to have social protection measures that address the middle and not just the bottom. But for the bottom, you have to put special emphasis and not only think about cash, but all the other dimensions that you need to bring in order to protect the human capital of the poor, so that, again, in the future, you ensure their ability to be inserted in the labor market in a better way than what we can foresee now.
Thank you very much, Nora. And everything that Nora is saying is very well documented in a lot of her work. So I invite you to check on her recent reports. I wanted to kind of add up into a question from one of our participants that mentioned to what extent we, the Latin America and the Caribbean, or in the case of Southeast Asia, are we really ready to get into technological change? And if we're not prepared, are we going to be isolated on how we can shorten the distance for that? But I wanted to kind of go with that question in something, we talk about how we're going to come with a destruction of value, going to be more poverty, maybe more inequality, despite the fact that we don't have a lot of penetration and a lot of the technological solutions. Phones have been very powerful in getting in the region. And there's a lot of information. And I wonder, I wonder, and I wanted your comment, do you think people will go into these new inequalities once have tasted what it is to be in the middle class passively? Do you think people that are super well connected, that were in the middle class and now they push back again, is this going to be a silent kind of passive decision that said, well, inequality is bad? Or should we expect something much more active from a young generation of people, extremely well connected, aware of what they are going to be losing and demanding better solutions? And I'm going to pass that initially to Ahmed, which I'm happy to say that your email is ahmed.mubarak at yale.edu, and he invited us to join him for anything that we wanted to replicate of his studies. So with that, do you think this is just that we go at the end of this tunnel and everybody's there just waiting for things to happen? Or we might see a little bit more of a shake-up on the social side? With that?
Yeah, yes, actually in the data that we're, I will share a screen again to talk about like how sort of what I alluded to, how mobile phone data can be used for the types of social benefit transfers that can be done. But I have to say that, like, in doing this work in Nigeria and to a less extent in Bangladesh, but in Nigeria it's been more of a problem, that people are already fed up. They're complaining. There are localized protests that are emerging where people are not getting they're not getting the benefits that they feel they need. They're not getting the relief that they need. So if the government's asking you to social distance, which also means economically distance, right? You're suffering, right? And if people feel like there's no relief that's being provided, right? Then they're going to start complaining, and they're not going to also follow your guidelines, right? And in these epidemiological models, we're assuming like perfect adherence. Whereas there, we need to add behavior to those models. We need to add economics to these models to make better predictions for countries like in the global south, in Latin America, Caribbean, but also Africa and Asia, right? And so let me just describe, how we're using the mobile phones as a positive force. I completely take your point, Ana Maria, that the mobile phones, the connectivity is a positive force in terms of getting people organized, right? Better connected, right? But how do we, as governments, as academics, how can we make use of the same force to help poor people? Right? So the first step that we had, like the discussions that we had with the government of Nigeria and Bangladesh, is okay, who do we need to help? Who do we need to support? So the standard answer is, of course, the poor people and the ultra poor, right? That's not a surprise. However, here's the concept that's emerged, that's become very popular in the media in Bangladesh, is the new poor, right? So these are people who are not traditionally part of your social security system. Like they're not used to, the government's not used to sending money to them, but they need support right now because they're facing large adverse shocks to their income, right? We talked about migrants earlier, that's one group, but also like certain occupations, right, are more at risk than others, right? So we need to figure out a way to identify them quickly, okay? And yet another discussion I had, now this was more or less, the first two categories were more like demand that I'm trying to respond to, demand from policymakers. But the third category is like the push that I made to them, is that, look, the other type of people that you might want to bring into the fold and help are people who might impose the largest negative health externalities on others. Right? So like, for example, people who are very mobile, who are like internal migrants, right? Because not only do they need to move around for their work, they can also move the disease around, and that's bad, right? So we need to think about how do we identify them, target them, give them relief on the condition that they like become less mobile, right? And so that means that another type of conceptual work down here is like, what is the modality for the transfer we send them? Is there a way for us to make it into a conditional cash transfer? Right? Where the condition is not that you send, like the normal conditions, like you send your daughter to school or take them to immunization. The condition might be you need to stay home, not move around. right? How do you impose that conditionality? We're not in a world where we can do strict monitoring and enforcement of conditions, right? So instead, you can use mobile phones there too, where if it's observed that your phone is moving around a lot, it keeps pinging into different cell towers, right? Then maybe you can send them a reminder. Remember, to take this money, the condition was you should stay at home, right? And then finally, how do we use the phones to identify the poor, right? So the first step that we already had done, thankfully, because of all the work I do in Bangladesh and others have done in Nigeria, is that we have survey data where we can identify who satisfy these criteria, whether the criteria is the poor or the most economically affected. And the recent phone surveys we did in the past month, the data I showed you earlier, that allows us to identify people who have faced the largest shocks, okay? And then the second step is merge in the phone's usage data for those people with their survey data, and then train a model, right? Develop the methodology to match the two things together and see if we can develop an algorithm that identifies the poor on the basis of their cell phone usage patterns, right? And once you do that, you can then develop, if it's an algorithm that you believe in, right? Like a machine learning algorithm. And how do you generate trust in it? It could be that you have data on 15,000 people, you use 10,000 to train the model, and the other 5,000 you have a holdout sample, and you test how well the model does its predictions, right? Once you feel confident, then you can give it back to the cell phone companies so that they can run that algorithm on their entire subscriber base. And if I have this problem of I need to identify the poor in the next 3 weeks, right? We have not been able to find better strategies than using mobile phones, right? And this is work I should point out with Joshua Blumenstock, who's in the School of Information Science, right? Who's a computer science background. So that's work by him, and is great stuff that everybody should read. Okay, and then the final thing I'll just point out here before I stop is that while I'm talking about machine learning, right, implementing such a system is really more about politics and sociology, right? It's not about machine learning, right? I got really excited as a researcher about the machine learning techniques and algorithms, right? That's what I like thinking about. But most of the time that I'm spending these past 2 weeks has been playing politics on how do I get the different mobile phone service providers to cooperate, because they're in a competitive environment. They're worried about, like, how do I come out of this? What happens to my market share relative to the other one, right? And then, of course, there are politicians who want to create lists and distribute funds. They don't want to do it this way, right? So while we have some proponents of our technique within the government, the more of the technocrats, there are other elements of the government who don't want a system like that, right? For the same reason that Mr. Trump wants to sign his name on all the checks he sends, all the checks that the Internal Revenue Service sends to poor Americans, right? And then the other important things that we have to worry about is that, look, it might be that the cell phone ownership rates, we know usage rates is lower among women, right? So if you design a system like this and we rely on the machine, right? Are we going to inadvertently exclude certain groups, like some minorities, some women, etc.? And we need to have the checks in place, checks and balances in place to address those problems, right? So ultimately, what are we doing in Bangladesh? We decided to do this in stages. Let's test the system in 50 districts, right? Let's see how it works, how people feel, because we're collecting phone survey data to track that. Let's see what happens to their food insecurity when I target them by a mobile phone, then I compare it to the traditional ways of targeting. Right? On the basis of those results, then in the next month, maybe we can think about scaling up.
Thank you. This is fascinating. I the reference for our audience here, because I'm going to Blumenstock, I think it is the name. It's very, very interesting work, and I think really point out in the right direction on how to use this technology for targeting and control the connectivity in favor of something that brings something better for the society. Nora, we're coming to an end of a very interesting conversation that in a way has been opening a lot of things to think. But it is your opportunity to tell us what things we shouldn't miss on our discussion for the future. How we can improve things for the better as we help the countries to work in public policy.
Well, like I said, I think it's very important to first remember that we have a crisis regardless of the pandemic. So even if we get rid of all the lockdowns, etc., we have to remember that the economic shock will be quite severe for the region, and we will have to be able to deal with it. And we've been talking all of micro here, but obviously the main strategies also happen at the macroeconomic level, and the IDB has to play a very important role in helping countries bridge the various gaps and be able to implement the policies at the macro level that mitigate the impact on economic activity on average, because that's the first component that will affect the poverty of individuals and what happens in the future. The second thing is that we don't have an opportunity now to engage more with Mushfiq, but I was wondering whether you can use the same technology to identify the informal workers that are not, covered by any of the social protection schemes, are not poor, that are mainly in urban areas, and are intermixed, if you want, with the others in terms of where they're located. I don't know how it would work, but I'm interested, if you don't mind, Ana María, if we could have an exchange on that for them, because
absolutely.
Please. Yeah, I think our audience will help will wait for us, because this is very interesting. Please go ahead.
So, okay. So let me just close my remarks as saying the following. So one is that we started with this discussion about lockdown versus not. Should Latin American countries think about things differently, right? I think it's time for us to move past this lockdown versus not debate, right? It's clear that the economic costs of full lockdowns are really hard for countries where there's a large informal sector, countries that are poorer, the benefits are smaller, as I said, right? The discussion now needs to be exactly how do we scale back lockdowns? Where do we make exemptions, right? So just to give you a simple example from Bangladesh, the rice harvest was happening right now, right? Whether or not we need to harvest that rice is not up for debate, right? It's not a reasonable debate. You have to harvest the rice, because otherwise you'll have a famine. Okay. But it's more the discussion that we need and the insights that we need from policies and from different disciplines is how do we protect worker safety while we're harvesting the rice? Because otherwise we'll have a much bigger problem in our hands, right? The fact that we need to get people to get their measles vaccines is not up for debate, right? They need to be able to go out and get the vaccination. Like, we argue about this R0, the reproductive rate of the virus for COVID to be 2 or 3. The reproductive rate for measles is like 18. The R0 is 18. Like, we cannot have that as a problem, right? So let's actually now move towards like having these more constructive discussions on the specific policies we need to enact, right? And Nora, I think the short answer to your question is that yes, that's a very difficult problem if people are not poor but they're suffering. But the thing is that this same type of method can be applied. The model and a machine learning model can be trained to try to target whoever it is that you want to target. So let's say with survey data, like I would have to get some survey data. So right now, we run a survey in Nicaragua or Guatemala that says, okay, these are the types of workers that I need to target. Let's identify them, okay? Once we identify them in the survey, then we can always, as long as we get the telecom records matched, we can always match the people you want to target and then train a model to identify them. So I think it is possible, right? But it requires some new survey data if you don't have existing information on them. And one other point I want to make here is that, like, when I was talking about the politics of implementing, right? Regulatory barriers are real, and it varies from one country to another. Nigeria is already very different from Bangladesh, I've learned, right? Which is that, some countries have like data security acts that look different from others, and matching data like this becomes more or less difficult. So this really requires like a multidisciplinary approach of legal scholars, of government, of private sector, of academics, of computer scientists, of economists to come together to solve these problems.
Yeah. Now, Ana María, I think that, you asked about the politics. We're not political scientists here, but I think that the truth is that we do face very severe dilemmas in terms of what we're going to do, because resources are scarce. Even if we find all the mechanisms and efficiently are able to find the losers who are not poor, but who may become poor. And like you said, they're not gonna go quietly, because people in the middle classes are going to be very upset with what's happening. And again, I emphasize it's not just the lockdowns. The lockdowns will be gone and the crisis will be here, and it might be here for 1 year or more, as we're hearing. So that group is going to crave support at the same time that you have the poor who also you need to attend, not only because they will also crave for support, but also because if you're worried about what the long-term impact is in terms of the effects on their ability to leave poverty, they will face more dire consequences than those in the middle. So you're going to be facing a bunch of dilemmas with scarce resources and lots of political conundrum in the region. So I think that we're facing a very, very serious situation and challenges that will need a lot of thinking to make sure that we come out of it relatively well off. Because right now, when you start thinking about it, you just want to go under a hole.
Thank you very much for both Ahmed Mushfiq and Nora, for all the people that were with us today. I think these final remarks are super interesting because they are telling two things. First, we didn't come to this pandemic with good health. There's a lot of problems that we were having, and they're going to stick with us, and we're carrying them over, magnified by the pandemic. The other one, which I think is great, that is what Ahmed put to the table, is looking past the discussion of lockdown or lockdown. Now there are things that have to be discussed and make sure that we do that promptly. This conversation, as you can imagine, having three clear minds in an hour and 15 minutes, is just a taste of what we should be reading on the works that they are doing. They had ideas that we should develop at the IDB. So of course it's short, but it was powerful, full of rich ideas, full of good studies that we have to look into. So I couldn't thank you more for being with us, devoting this time. We know that you have people from all over the world asking the same questions, and we're generous. We attended our questions, and we hope to have you soon for discussions in some of the things that you pointed out today. So with that, thank you very much. Thank you for our audience. We will put all the studies in line, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, and gracias a todos.
Gracias. Hasta pronto.
Chao, lindo español. Qué bueno.
Sí.
Bye.
Bye.
Chao.